From KUT News and the Texas Tribune, this is The Ticket.
We demand our liberty.
But this election is not just about what laws we're going to pass.
Americans have come back from some pretty tough economic times.
But we can and must do better.
And we are going to make our country great again.
I'm Ben Philpott.
And I'm Jay Root.
This week on the show, another Super Tuesday and another big night for Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Jay and I will go over the results and try to figure out what it means as we creep closer to this summer's national conventions, which on the GOP side should be interesting.
Just how interesting? We'll talk with former Texas GOP Chairman Steve Munisteri about what exactly could happen as the party heads to Cleveland without any of the candidates holding enough delegates to win the nomination.
And to further explain what could happen when delegates hit the floor in Ohio, we bring you a dramatization of the choices ahead for delegates. But first, Jay, we are recording this on the morning of March 16th, and here's what we know about last night. Let's start with the Democrats. Hillary Clinton won in Ohio, Florida, Illinois, and North Carolina. She's got a slim lead, as we're talking here, in Missouri as the final votes are being counted there. Surprises, comments from that on what happened last night with the Democrats?
Well, I think this is further confirmation that Bernie Sanders is becoming a message candidate, and I think we'll have we'll look back on this and think that and know that Bernie Sanders had a major impact on the race and had a lot of enthusiasm, but, he's not going to make it.
I was looking at 538.com has a great chart showing kind of the track that each candidate needs to do on both Republican and Democratic side in terms of gaining its delegates and how on track it is to get to the magic number to become the nominee. As of this morning, Hillary Clinton has over 100%. I think it's like 104% of the delegates she needs to make her way on her track, so she's ahead of schedule. Bernie Sanders is at about 80% of the delegates he needs on this track again, so he's behind where he needs to be right now to get that nomination.
Look, the Democrats is a more conventional race. This is, we can look at past experience and look at what's happening on the Democratic side and recognize what we're seeing. We can't really say that about the Republican side. I mean, we're just off the rails on in so many ways on the Republican side.
So let's get to the Republicans. We have Donald Trump winning in Florida, Illinois, North Carolina, and again, as of this taping, a slim lead in Missouri. John Kasich won his home state of Ohio, and of course, Marco Rubio dropped out. So I had someone actually ask me who was the biggest loser last night. Was it Marco Rubio because he dropped out? Or was it maybe Ted Cruz because he got second and third in all those states?
Yeah, look, Donald Trump is the only one who had a great night last night on the Republican side. I guess Rubio had a horrible night, obviously. He lost his home state. What a fall from a guy who was such a new face, a rising star. I mean, 2010, it hasn't been that long ago. The Tea Party year, and he roared onto the scene, fluent Spanish speaker, young guy, Tea Party, but also had some mainstream tendencies, and I think that's probably what did him in, was that he went along with what Republicans call amnesty, basically allowing undocumented immigrants to stay here, and put on a path to citizenship, and that was seen as treason, really, and he paid dearly for that. For Ted Cruz, it's a tough deal. I don't know, I do think he's an alternative, but now because of Ohio, because John Kasich won Ohio, he's going to keep going, so they're going to keep splitting it up. I do think that, and as we'll talk about later in the show, that the chances of a contested convention it's now likely. For the first time in my career as a reporter, we've talked about this year after year, and it's always like, oh, we might have a contested convention, then it fades, and then nobody talks about it again. Actually, now the chances are better than even that we are going to have a contested convention.
Well, and it'll be really interesting, these made-for-TV events that are the national conventions always have that roll call vote on the last day of the convention, so that you can have, you have all the build-up speeches ahead of time, you have that roll call vote, you anoint the nominee, and then the nominee comes and delivers, an amazing speech, and you go out and you hope to win the election. If we have a contested convention, they're going to have to do that roll call. Maybe they have to do that on day one to see what's going on, because they may need day two to do the second ballot, and then the afternoon of day two to do a third ballot. It's going to be really interesting to see how they arrange that convention.
Is that before or after the tear gas?
Oh, well, we'll see. I'll bring my goggles if I end up heading on to Cleveland. Here's the delegate total as of March 16th, not including Missouri, as both parties there have very tight races. For the Democrats, Hillary Clinton has 1,132 delegates. Bernie Sanders has 818. Now, these totals do not include superdelegates. Clinton has about a 425 delegate lead there with superdelegates. On the GOP side, Donald Trump has about 661 delegates, Ted Cruz 406, John Kasich 142, Marco Rubio 169, more than Kasich. Now, Rubio's dropped out, so why do we care about how many delegates Rubio has? Well, we're going to get to that a little later.
That's little Marco to you. So obviously still close on both sides, but let's focus on the GOP right now. Specifically, what could happen at the Republican National Convention this July in Cleveland if none of the candidates have 1,237 delegates? That's the magic number needed to win the nomination.
To help us figure this out, we've called on our expert for the Republican Party and its rules. That's former Texas GOP Chairman Steve Munisteri. Let me just start with what we know at the moment. How many delegates does a candidate need to get a nomination?
Need 1,237.
And what's the process for voting on those candidates at the convention?
Well, the chairman of the delegation will take a roll call, so to speak, of who the delegates are, who's there. But in most states, there's a requirement for the delegates to vote in accordance with the results of either a caucus or a convention. And the RNC changed its rules last time so that only votes in accordance with state party rules will be recognized. So what that means is, for all the delegates that have a state party rule that obligate them to vote for a certain candidate, only votes in accordance with that rule will be recorded. So the significance of that is that the delegates, when they arrive at the convention, will be predetermined, for the most part, to vote for a particular candidate. However, about 3/4 of those delegates will be unbound on the second ballot, and I would presume almost 100% would be unbound by a third ballot, and then they can vote for whoever they want. In addition, there will be at least 284 delegates going into this convention that are not bound by party rules to vote for a particular candidate. So that could make it exceptionally interesting.
And so that was my final question, the one final thing that we know heading into the convention. You mentioned that chunk of unpledged delegates. Where do they come from?
Well, there are several states like Wyoming, North Dakota, along with the territories that do not take a vote on the presidential race. So the delegates just run as delegates, although campaigns have recruited people to run. So, for example, Wyoming has 29 delegates. It was reported this weekend that Ted Cruz won 9 of them. But it's important to note that under their party rules, those 9 delegates are not bound to vote for Ted Cruz. So Ted Cruz's people presumably recruited people who supported Ted Cruz to run for him. But somebody was of great persuasion, they could actually change one of those delegates' minds, and they would be allowed to vote for somebody. So those types of delegates account for 121 of the delegates. And some of those delegates that run, particularly in the territories, we just had some contests in the Virgin Islands and in Guam. Some of those delegates run as being unbound and uncommitted anyway. So there's 121 of those, plus there are 11 delegates that under state party rules have already been released because candidates have suspended their campaign. And then there are 54 delegates in Pennsylvania that are not bound by state party rule to vote for the candidate for whom they said they were for. So that totals up to 184, but you may have more as you go on if states elect people from an uncommitted bloc, or if a candidate drops out and party rules in a particular state release those delegates.
I'm not sure there's anybody alive today that can remember when a convention really went off the rails. But let's move into what we don't know. What is the first thing that happens after you take a vote on the convention floor? All these delegates are gathered, and nobody gets a majority.
You have a second round and a third round and a fourth round. And I would just remind people that in 1924, there were 103 rounds at a Democratic convention. It took 16 days.
Wow. So let's talk about the whole delay factor. I mean, you know, people, we've gotten used to these modern conventions becoming coronations, and the parties have used them to try to put the best foot forward for their nominees, and they're highly scripted. I mean, after some candidate doesn't get a majority on the first ballot, I presume the script goes out the door, and you know, it's Katie bar the door, right? I mean, it could go for days on end. What do people do about their hotels and all of that? I mean,
well, those are interesting logistical problems, which is a modern convention is not really set to go into overtime because there's so many hotel rooms that you have to have, and the convention city blocks those out for a certain number of days, and you only have the convention center for a certain number of days. So presumably we're really not set up for a 1924 situation where we probably could handle a 1940 situation. In 1940, Wendell Willkie, who, by the way, had never held public office before, just ran as a businessman, was elected on the fifth ballot. So, you know, it might be 6 a.m. the next morning, but you could get through 5 ballots.
So I want you to put or pull out your crystal ball here, and let's assume that, I mean, Donald Trump's looking pretty strong in a lot of places, and he's racked up quite a lot of delegates. And, you know, let's presume that he goes in with a plurality but not a majority, and he needs in the low hundreds, let's say 200 or less. He needs, or 150, somewhere in that range. You know, would it be as simple as like, hey, there's some unpledged delegates. Can you give some inducements to these delegates? Can you say, we'll find jobs for you? Is that all legal?
I don't think you could have a quid pro quo like that. However, you know, things can be implied, and that is how Abraham Lincoln won a contested convention back in 1860, is his people promised all sorts of cabinet posts to people as inducement. So we do have some modern history as to what can occur. I was at the last contested convention in 1976, where there were only 2 candidates, so you knew you were going to have a winner on the first ballot. However, neither candidate had 50% of bound delegates going in. Even though you might have had an advantage going in, your delegates could change their minds. I remember that summer in 76 when it was either Time or Newsweek did a delegate-by-delegate breakdown, and they had Ronald Reagan, I believe it was 8 delegates ahead of Ford by their count. But by the time we got to the convention, Ford had done such a great job of switching delegates. So, for example, Mississippi was supposed to be what's called the unit rule, which means that you take an internal poll of your delegation, and whoever gets 50%, you then vote the entire delegation winner take all at the convention. So it's not winner take all in the primary, but it's winner take all on the convention floor. The Ford people got Mississippi to change that. Clark Reed, who was the Mississippi delegation chair, who had been pledged to Reagan, switched to Ford and took a bunch of delegates with him. And President Ford, I'm doing this by memory, but I believe I'm correct on this, actually flew some of the delegates to the White House, invited them up to the White House to personally lobby them. So you don't have to necessarily be promised anything, but if a presidential candidate pays attention to you and you join their team, I think there's an assumption that when the ambassadorships are handed out, or when one of several thousand jobs in Washington are handed out, you might get one.
You've mentioned a couple of times the idea of different states having different rules. You just talked about Mississippi having a different rule for how it counted its delegates or pledged the delegates back in '76. Also a little bit about, whether a delegate would be totally unbound on the second ballot or maybe by the third ballot based on the individual state rules. How does the fact that we have, 50 states with many different variations of delegate rules, how does that affect what's going to happen in Cleveland?
Well, it affects it a lot, but let me also point out that it's more than just 50 states. You have 50 states plus 5 territories plus the District of Columbia, so there's a good number of delegates there. So, for example, the Virgin Islands, Guam, those all have 9 delegates each. Puerto Rico, I think it was 23 delegates they had. So there's actually 56 different set of rules. So for each state, they have their own rules, but then the RNC puts parameters that the states have to adhere to, otherwise there'll be delegate penalties. So there is no longer a unit rule right now, because in the RNC rules it says states aren't allowed to have unit rules. Unit rule being that at the convention you take a poll of your delegation, and if the delegation votes majority one way, everybody agrees to vote winner take all. So currently you have about 3/4 of the delegates will become unbound after the first ballot. In Texas, you're not completely unbound to the third ballot. So after the first ballot, the only people that are unbound is if the candidate releases the delegates or the candidate does not get 20% of the delegates on the first ballot. So Rubio has 3 delegates in Texas. There's a possibility, say, Rubio doesn't get 20% of the delegates on the first ballot at a national convention. His 3 delegates in Texas would be unbound to vote for whoever they wanted to on the second ballot. But if Cruz and Trump, who are the only other 2 candidates that have Texas delegates, both get 20% or more of the convention votes, then their delegates can't be unbound to the third ballot. Now, to further complicate things for you, there's a big misconception about the RNC rules. Everybody keeps talking about the RNC rules that will be in effect. The RNC rules, as they apply to the activities at the convention and how the convention is to proceed, actually expire as you go into the convention. Or another way to say that is, there actually is a rules committee at the convention that will adopt rules as to how the convention should go forward. So the rules that are in place now as to how the convention is to be conducted were the rules that were in effect for 2012. You will not know the rules for 2016 until the Rules Committee meets, has a draft, and then the convention has to vote the rules up or down. So you could have some major rule changes at the convention that can affect all of it.
Could we clear up the confusion about the terminology, Steve? Because a lot of people are saying brokered convention, and then and then we talk about contested convention. Tell me the difference between the terms contested and brokered. I mean, you can't get a brokered without a contested, but a contested doesn't necessarily mean a brokered, right?
So to me, the only real difference between a contested convention and a brokered convention is a contested convention is one that goes to a first ballot or just has two candidates, and a brokered means anything that goes past the first ballot, because then you have to switch delegates. Now, the way some of the candidates, like Senator Cruz, is using it, he's adding some definition to brokered, which I don't add, but people can have their own definition. He's saying that a brokered convention means when you have party bosses coming in and trying to broker a deal between different factions to bring in another candidate, or that party bosses are getting together and delivering blocks of delegates.
Is that kind of like the Mitt Romney will sweep in and get the nomination scenario idea?
Yes, but in reality, if you don't make it on the first ballot, some delegates have to switch or you'll never have a nominee. So presumably if delegates are switching, people are talking to them, people are trying to put together deals, people are trying to cajole. So in my mind, it's a definition without a distinction. I mean, in my mind, once you get past the first ballot, it always is going to be brokered. It's just to the extent to which it's brokered. You can have a brokered convention without party bosses sitting in a room. A brokered convention could be, Ted Cruz goes to Marco Rubio and says, I'll make you my VP candidate, help try to get me my delegates. I mean, to me, that's a brokered convention.
Given the high emotion and the way, I mean, nobody seems to have wavering a whole lot on Donald Trump. You're with him, and you're with him strongly, or you hate him, is what I've sort of seen it. But it seems to me like what you were talking about with the delegate pool, the fact that they're party regulars, and I can see in Texas exactly what you're saying, that they would be stacked with Cruz supporters. If Donald Trump doesn't win on the first ballot, a lot of those people are probably going to be glad they're not bound to him anymore, right?
That's my own personal belief. I mean, I think of all the candidates, Donald Trump is likely to be the one that loses delegates after the first ballot, unless he's just so close, within 100 delegates that people think he's going to be the nominee anyway, and they want to curry favor. But I don't view Donald Trump as the type that would be likely to have the delegate who is the 20-year precinct chairman or the 10-year county chairman. I view those more likely to be with one of the other candidates. So I think if Donald Trump is not either the winner on the first ballot or very close, within, say, a couple hundred delegates of the nomination on the first ballot, then I think it switches to other candidates.
Steve Munisteri is the former head of the Texas GOP, and he helped write the current rules that the RNC are operating under and the rules for the current primary season. Steve, thanks so much for taking time to talk with us today.
You're very welcome. Call anytime.
Steve Munisteri laid a great foundation for us to be able to decipher what could happen in the GOP convention, but you, our faithful listeners, had a few more questions, so Jay and I are going to take a crack at them. Here's question number one we got. If Trump is defeated for the nomination, what role can he or should he play in the convention?
Isn't this hard to imagine? I mean, what a spoiler he would be. The thing is that the Republicans, whether they like it or not, they need Donald Trump. So they're either going to make him their nominee, or I don't know what inducement you can give somebody with $5 to $10 billion who really obviously I think now wants this thing to help them win this for the Republican Party in November. But if Donald Trump takes all his marbles and goes home, it's a disaster for the Republicans. I mean, it could be it's kind of a disaster. I could make the argument that it's a disaster either way, okay? But if they take this away from Donald Trump at the convention because he's 100 delegates short, I I just can't imagine the piss off that's going to inflict.
Here's the next question here. We've got a couple of questions asking about outside candidates who could come swooping in and win a brokered GOP convention. Here's an example. In the case of a contested convention, would Paul Ryan have the advantage? Another one here, are there people who are not current candidates who would be better off than those that are already in the mix, like Mitt Romney, like Paul Ryan? And, to answer this question, I checked back in with Steve Munisteri for this one. He says, no, Paul Ryan would not have any advantage. He believes he would actually be at a disadvantage because he doesn't have any delegates coming into the convention, unlike someone like Kasich or Rubio, who does have some delegates somewhere, or Ted Cruz, who does have delegates heading into the convention. However, though, we did see today a little bit of news on the Paul Ryan for President front, where former Speaker John Boehner says, hey, let's have him be our nominee if we can't get a first ballot.
Yeah, the PR challenge of that is pretty enormous. So I think coming out with somebody who wasn't even running for president will be such a shocker, would be such a shocker to so many voters that I just don't know if the Republicans, I'm sure the hierarchy, the donors, the establishment, as it were, would love to have somebody other than either Ted Cruz or Donald Trump, but they're going to have to swallow the pill here, I think.
All right, so next question here. What further changes to the primary calendar or the debate schedule should Republicans make to avoid the issues of the 2016 cycle? We saw between 2012 and 16, they actually cut down on the number of debates. They also front-loaded the primary with 2/3 of the delegates so that you wouldn't have this long, drawn-out primary season like they did last time with Mitt Romney, where they felt like it weakened Mitt Romney. He was absolutely going to be the nominee, but because the calendar had been stretched out so far, he had all these debates and he had all these primary elections, and they think it made him weaker heading in against Barack Obama. So they changed it.
How did that work out?
Yeah, exactly. So
they were fighting the last battle.
Steve Munisteri has actually talked to us about this and said, look, the problem is that you are trying to fight future wars based on changes you would make to the war you just had. And it's just a losing proposition. So what changes should they make? You can offer several for what they should make to stop a Donald Trump. But are you going to have a Donald Trump in 2020?
Here's one that I think they might consider, because you look at what's happening right now, and Donald Trump is sort of like an independent candidate running, and he has some unorthodox views. Mm-hmm. I would not be surprised, and this is just conjecture, complete conjecture on my part, but I would not be surprised if there's a movement to make it a Republican-only deal where you tighten up the rules, that you can't just last minute come in as a Democrat, come in as an independent, same-day registration, whatever, that they're going to tighten the rules to say in the Republican primary, this is the Republican Party, you got to declare your allegiance, you got to say you're registered Republican, whatever. That would not surprise me.
All right, we've got a next question here. Who would the brokers be in a brokered convention? Are these actual politicians that everyone knows? Is it backroom K Street folks like the ones featured in the Steakhouse segment of Showtime's The Circus series that they've got going on? Let's check back in with Steve Munisteri for this one. I posed the question to him. He says that there are no official brokers. Presumably, though, the people working the floor and the delegates would be campaign leadership, party leadership, elected officials, all trying to put together a winning coalition to support their respective candidates. So, I guess the answer is kind of the people you would expect. Those are the people that are going to try to be swaying their authority on the floor.
I want to bring in Bob Dole to do this.
One more question here from our listeners. Would the whole ticket composition, that's vice president, cabinet appointments, all be kind of up for grabs at a brokered convention? He says that he thinks Ted Cruz would be willing to maybe give up his delegates if it meant a Supreme Court nomination out of the brokered convention. But I think that vice president, that certainly could be. There's already been multiple articles written on the idea of Marco Rubio giving up his delegates to whatever candidate. Maybe it's Trump, maybe it's Cruz, who pick him for the vice presidential candidate.
But I don't think he gets to. The delegates, Marco Rubio's delegates, don't have to do what he says. Though,
No,
right?
they don't.
Aren't they unbound?
Well, it depends on the rules, as you know. Some of them are unbound after a first ballot. Some of them it's after a second ballot. I think that it would be kind of a bully pulpit. Hey, those of you who are voting for me, I would prefer that you now switch over and vote for. And of course, that he has more sway if he's the vice presidential candidate. He's saying, you may or may not like whoever picked him to be the VP, Ted Cruz or Donald Trump. But remember, I'm still on the ticket. So you are still, a vote for them is still a vote for me. So come on and vote.
As much as we've talked about contested conventions and all that, I think we've become experts. You think we could actually get hired to advise some people now?
Maybe we can run some of the floor action in Cleveland. And now, the return of the straight ticket.
The votes are in, the convention is set, but the winner is still in doubt. It's time for another episode of Delegate Dilemma. This week, what could happen if the Republican convention begins with only Donald Trump and Ted Cruz left in the race, but neither has the delegates needed to win the nomination on the first roll call vote? We join the action with two delegates discussing what they can and can't do during that first vote and subsequent others.
Oh, goodness, I'm so nervous about this vote.
Excuse me, hi?
Oh, hello.
Could you help me? I'm a delegate from Texas, and I'm trying to find my section.
First time at the convention, huh? Texas. Now, let's see. Oh, you're over here, section 212.
Oh, thanks. So what state are you from?
I'm a Trump delegate from Florida. I assume you're a Cruz delegate since you're from Texas.
Actually, no. I'm one of the 3 delegates Marco Rubio picked up. And based on Texas party rules, even though he dropped out, I have to cast my vote for him on the first ballot.
Really? Even though Rubio released his delegates last week when Ted Cruz announced he would pick Rubio for his pick for vice president?
Yep. Rules are rules.
Woo! I'm free!
Who's that?
Oh, that's a delegate from Colorado. His state decided to leave all their delegates unbound heading to the convention, so on the first ballot, he could vote for anyone he wants.
Who's gonna give me something?
Wait, why is he screaming about people giving him stuff?
Oh, well, the campaigns have been working on him and all the other unpledged delegates for the last month. Calling, asking, begging, sometimes promising stuff.
Like what?
Like what? Like what? Like anything I want. I've already been taken to dinner 3 times. I got a private meeting with Donald Trump. I got a selfie with Ted Cruz. Former Speaker of the House John Boehner says he'll take me golfing if I vote for Paul Ryan. Woohoo!
Yeah, and as the stakes get higher, so do the promises. Maybe a position in state government, maybe an ambassadorship, a little something to sweeten the pot.
Wow, maybe I'll get a little bit of that on the second vote.
What?
Well, according to the rules from the Texas GOP, after the first ballot, I can vote for whoever I want, because the candidate I'm tied to won't have at least 20% of the delegate vote on that first ballot. And I'm a huge Cruz supporter.
Wait, how'd you get to be a Rubio delegate if you're a Cruz supporter?
Oh, easily. You see, the Cruz campaign came to the Texas Republican Convention and made a huge push in all the meetings to nominate and elect Cruz supporters to the delegate positions. So while Trump and Rubio will get support from Texas delegates on the first ballot, on the second, Rubio delegates are free to vote for anyone because Rubio didn't get at least 20% of the delegate count.
Wait, what about the Trump delegates?
Because Trump has more than 20% of the delegate support, his Texas delegates are bound to him on the first and second ballot. But on the third, it's Cruz time.
But I'm a Donald Trump supporter, and he has the most delegates heading into the convention.
That doesn't matter after the first roll call.
You don't matter after the first roll call.
That doesn't make sense. That you don't matter. Donald Trump doesn't matter. He's got tiny hands.
They're bigger than Rubio's hands.
Rubio has perfect.
That's all this week on Delegate Dilemma. Thanks to our actors, Emily Mudert, Andrew Weber, and Matt Largy. Join us next week to see what happens on the second vote, and the third, and the fourth, as the GOP delegates take their best shot at picking a nominee.
And I am not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. Hey, yo, I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot. We gonna rise up.
That's it this week from The Ticket. Want to hear any of our previous episodes? You can find them on iTunes by searching The Ticket 2016. And if you could please leave us a review, it helps others find our podcast.
You can also find us on our website, theticket2016.com. and on the soon-to-be-open podcast section of Google Play.
Want to send us a podcast idea? You can reach us on Twitter at TheTicket2016 or on email theticket2016@gmail.com.
The Ticket is a co-production of KUT News and the Texas Tribune. Our editor is KUT News Managing Editor Matt Largy, and our theme music is by Ben Root. Thanks for listening.